everyone, and welcome back to another Paletteful Packs video. My name is Monique Renee, and today I have the Young Artist box for January. I'm so excited about this, so let's open her on up. The first thing we have in here is some watercolors. Watercolor is my absolute favorite paint media to work with, and I am so excited to teach you guys some watercolor techniques today. In here we've also got some paintbrushes. We have a Robert Simmons round brush, and we've also got a pack of teeny tiny little brushes too. We have a paint palette. We are going to do all of our mixing here. We've got a cute little cat sticker. Look how cute! We have a small pack of illustration board, and we've got a Strathmore watercolor sketchbook. This is really cool because, as you can see, we've actually got some tutorials on how to use watercolors in here. We've got some information about different supplies, different paintbrushes, a little bit about the paints themselves, about the different properties of watercolors, how to mix watercolors, and then we've got a few lessons in here as well. I will definitely be going over some of these techniques, probably not all of them, but this is awesome because you can go through these on your own and learn and kind of discover these different techniques for yourself. You can also go to this website here, strathmorelearning.com, to download some templates to use with this paper. Here is everything that comes in this month's box. As you can see, we've got a lot of supplies here, and I'm so excited to just jump right on in. I'm going to teach you guys a little bit about watercolors as a paint medium and how to use them in some different watercolor techniques. All right, let's jump right on in. The first thing we are going to do is we are going to create a color wheel with our paints. It's very important to try to do this when you're using a brand new art supply because each art supply is going to look a little bit different, especially with the different colors that you get. You want to make sure that you try out the different colors and see what they look like before you start doing a completed piece. So to start, we are going to open our watercolors, and you might notice that these may look a little different from watercolors than you're used to. Watercolors can come in two different types. They can come in a tube like this, or they can come in a pan already dried. Here is an example of pan watercolors. This is from my collection at home, which is why it looks so messy. But watercolors can either come like this or like this. They're both watercolors, and they're both going to react pretty much the same way once you start painting with them. Because we have these tubes though, what we need to do is get the paint onto our palette so we can use it. Start by unscrewing your paint and squeezing a little bit of paint into your palette. You do not need a whole lot of paint. A little bit of watercolor goes a very long way. We are then going to repeat this with all of our colors. Now we only have 10 slots here for paint, so what we're going to do is we are going to take our white and our Payne's gray and we're going to put those to the side. We're not going to use those right now. This color I just used is yellow, so we're going to add our scarlet, our alizarin crimson, our ultramarine, our cerulean blue, yellowish green, deep green, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and finally burnt umber. The cool thing about watercolors is that they're activated with water, so if the paint dries in the palette, that's okay, we can reactivate it with water and still use it. That also means that these paints are going to last you a very long time. So don't be afraid about wasting any of these paints because you're gonna have plenty of it. Now that we have our paints, we're gonna set that aside for just a moment and get the rest of our supplies. We are also going to need a cup of water and some paper towels. We are going to open our sketchbook, find our first blank page, and you can either remove the pages from the book or keep them in. That's kind of up to you. The book does suggest removing them, but I understand sometimes you like to keep all of your practice work in one place. For the sake of this video, I'm going to keep everything in here for now. The very first thing we are going to do is we are going to do something called color swatching. Color swatching is when you take your paint or your new art supplies and you try out all of the different colors on a piece of paper to see what the colors are going to look like. This is very important when you're using something new because you're not really going to understand how the colors look on paper until you put them to paper. I also like keeping this in an area that I can come back to because when I'm working on paintings, I can then use this as a reference to look at the different colors and kind of look at how they'll interact together and use that knowledge to then plan out the rest of my paintings. I like to do this before I even do a color wheel. So we are going to do a color wheel, but we are going to swatch first. We are going to use this part of our paper to do our swatches and leave this blank. So keep that in mind while you're doing this. The first thing I'm going to do is write down all of the names of my colors so that way I can come back and reference them later. It's not going to help me much if I don't know which color goes to which swatch. I'm then going to take the bigger brush that we have. This is the Robert Simmons round brush. I'm going to wet it a little bit in my water. I'm going to dry it a little bit on my paper. If your brush has too much water in it, it's going to be harder to control. Then to start, I'm going to pick up my paint with the paintbrush and just place it down next to that color. Now I'm going to do two different things. I'm going to make a little square with the paint, and that's going to be the solid color of the paint. I'm just going to pick it straight up from the palette and put it onto the paper. The next thing I'm going to do is going to be a little different. I'm going to pick up the color, place it onto the paper like so, and then I'm going to wet my paintbrush. I'm going to clean it off, dry it off a little bit, but while it's still wet, I'm going to take my paintbrush and drag it across the paper. And as I drag it, you see the color is going to get lighter. This is a wash of color. I basically took the color and dragged it out, so now we have a full range of that color. I do this so I can see what the color is going to look like when you take it straight from the palette versus when you dilute it with water. When using watercolor, you're going to use different ratios of paint to water. That can affect how the color looks. That's why it's nice to be able to see what that's going to look like in one place. We are going to continue this with all the other colors. If you need to use a bigger area, that's okay. I've done this before, I'm used to it, so I can kind of control this a bit easier. If you need to use the whole page, that's okay. Don't be afraid to use the whole page. If you can, however, keep a little space to the side, that would be ideal because we are going to use the rest of this page for something else. Also, be sure to clean off your brush thoroughly before you go on to the next color. We want to try to get the color as pure as possible. Now, watercolor is a really unique paint because, like the name suggests, it is water soluble. That means it's used with water. You can see when you add water to the paint, it makes the paint react in a really interesting way. Basically, wherever water is on your paper, the watercolor is going to follow it and flow into it. You can see when you take the color straight out of the tube and onto the paper, it's very dark, it's very pigmented. However, as soon as you add that water, the color just melts. Watercolor is also transparent. That means that even when you put the color down, you'll be able to see what's underneath it. This is very unique with paint. It also creates some really, really beautiful effects. As you can see here, as the watercolor dries, you can see the texture of the paper underneath. Watercolor artists use this to their advantage. I'll also show you this a little later, but that means that you can layer the colors on top of each other to get some really beautiful effects. These are just some of the properties of watercolor and why so many people use watercolors over something like acrylic paint or oil paint. Watercolor, however, can also be extremely hard to control because I don't know if you've tried to control water before, but it's a little difficult. It can be tricky to get the hang of, but trust me when I say watercolor is so fun and so free. Personally, watercolor is my favorite medium of all time. I love the looseness of it, I love how unpredictable it is, and I love the organic shapes and textures that you can get with watercolor paint. My hope is that by teaching you some different watercolor techniques, you will also fall in love with watercolors and keep using them and keep discovering fun ways to use them in your own unique way. So these are all of our swatches. We can now take a look at each color and see what it's going to look like. This is important because we have 2 different reds, 2 blues, 2 greens, 2 yellows, and 2 browns. If you just looked at the colors scarlet and alizarin crimson without swatching, it would be hard to tell which is going to look like which. Especially when it comes to stuff like ultramarine and cerulean blue. These blues are very, very different, and using these different blues is going to achieve different looks. Now you may be thinking, wait, we don't have an orange and we don't have a purple. What are we going to do about those colors that we don't have? And we are going to mix those. And for that, we are going to mix ourselves a color wheel. So the first thing you want to do is sketch out a circle. Do not worry about this circle being perfect. Now we're going to split the circle in half. And we're going to do that again and one more time. Again, don't worry, this doesn't have to be even. Now we're going to fill in yellow, red, and blue. Those are our primary colors. Now in between, we're going to have our secondary colors. This is going to be orange, purple, and green. So we're going to start with yellow. We're going to use this yellow right here to start. So take that color from your palette and just place it down. You'll notice that the color is a little gummy. So what you can do is just take some water and just fill in that whole area. Now we're going to take red. You'll notice we have 2 different reds here. And when it comes to color mixing, those reds are going to interact differently with our yellow. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to be using scarlet first. So take your scarlet color, lay it down. And again, if you have to, feel free to grab some water. For our blue, we are going to use ultramarine. So pick that up and place it down. Now here comes the fun part. We're going to go over to our palette and we're going to pick up a little bit of yellow and place it down in the middle here. Now this is important. Before you go to grab the red, make sure to clean off your brush. What we don't want is any color getting where it shouldn't be in these little pods. We want these colors inside to stay as 100% their own color as they can. We're then going to pick up some red and place it beside it. Now we are going to mix the 2 colors together. Now we have created orange and we can place that down right beside it. Now we're going to do the same thing except with the red and the blue colors. So take a little bit of your scarlet, place it onto your palette, wipe off your brush, take a little bit of the ultramarine blue, also place it down in your palette and mix the 2 together. Now we have purple. Now we do have some greens in our kit here, but for the sake of completing the color wheel, I'm going to mix a green by using our yellow and blue. A little bit of blue and a little bit of yellow. Mix those together and we've got green. Now you can see this green looks very different from the greens that we have. That just means that the two colors that went into mixing these greens is different than these two colors here. That also means that we have access to a whole different range of greens. Now you may be wondering, what would it be like if instead of using ultramarine blue, I used cerulean blue? And to that I say, well, go ahead and find out. I encourage you to try any kind of color combinations or anything that pops into your head. Go ahead and just try it and see what happens. When we do that, we get a purple that looks like this instead. Or say instead of yellow, we want to use yellow ochre. Take some of that. And add it to, let's see, scarlet and see what that looks like. And that creates an orange that looks more like that. The color differences are subtle, but they are there and they will give you different effects. I encourage you to just take some time and try mixing different colors and see what they look like. Now I also want to talk to you guys a little bit about the different brushes that we have. This is a very nice universal brush because the bristles can hold a good amount of water in them. But we've also got like this tiny little brush. This is going to be good for details because of its tiny like little bristles. So what we could do is dip it into a color and we can get much thinner lines like that. But if we were to try to create a wash with this little paintbrush, it's possible, but it's not going to have quite the same effect. A good rule of thumb is if you're trying to cover a bigger area, use a bigger brush. Now there are some other watercolor techniques I want to go over before we start going into a painting too. We have what our colors look like, but how do we actually apply them to the paper in a way that makes sense? There are a few different techniques that we're going to do. We've already done something called wet on dry, and that is essentially when we took our wet paint and applied it to a dry paper. As you can see, this is the effect that we got with that. But what happens when we apply a wet paint onto wet paper? To do this, we're going to take our paintbrush, dip it in our water, and just apply the water to the paper. Really saturate that area with water. Now take any color you like. I'm going to take cerulean blue because it's pretty. Put some of that on your paintbrush and dip it into the wet paper. As you can see, it looks a little different. You can see that the paint is kind of feathering outward where that wet water went. You can take more water on top of it and really just blend it out. Basically with watercolor, wherever water is on the paper, the watercolor is going to follow. So if we took our wet paintbrush again and did that, you can see that the paint is going to follow into wherever you place water. Now what would happen if, while the paper is still wet, you take another color? Let's take some green and place it down. You'll see that the colors start to mix together on their own. You can take your brush and mix them even more if you would like. And you can get some really pretty effects this way. This is called wet on wet technique. It's when you take a paint and drop it into a paper that is already wet. This makes mixing a lot easier. When you mix colors or blend colors with watercolor, you're always going to use water when you do so. If you try to blend colors without using water, you're gonna get frustrated and it's gonna be really difficult. Now you might also be wondering, how do I get a color that's lighter because we don't have a white? Traditionally with paint, if you want to make a color lighter in tint, you add white. And if you want to make it darker, you add black. We do have these two colors, however, we're going to still put those to the side. Because watercolor is a transparent medium, if you want a lighter color, you dilute your color with water. So I'm going to go over to my mixing palette over here, and I'm going to take a tiny bit of cerulean and mix it with a lot of water. Now I have a super light color. That's because the color is so diluted and the white of the paper is showing through. What if we wanted to have a color go from a very smooth gradient from one color to another? For this one, I'm going to use Scarlet and Cerulean Blue to show you. We're going to take Cerulean Blue, place it down, and we're going to use a lot of water. We're going to make sure this is very wet. We're going to do the same thing with Scarlet over here. Place that down there. To connect the two, we're going to use a clean paintbrush that is very wet, and we're going to drag the paint across. And we're going to mix the two colors together on the paper. Now we have a gradient from blue to red. Another thing to keep in mind is that the watercolors will often dry lighter than when you put them down. This looked really dark at first, but now that it's dried, it looks a little bit lighter and Now I do want to mention before we start on our finished piece that you do want to make sure you are using the correct type of paper with watercolor paint. This paper is made specifically to hold up water. If you were to use, say, computer paper or printer paper, when you apply the water to the paper is going to get crumbly, it may fall apart, it may dissolve. So you want to make sure that you're using paper that is specifically made to use with watercolors. Now, all of these lessons in this book are really great and really good to help you kind of get used to watercolors. A lot of these lessons also have video tutorials and templates that you can go and look at on your own. Because of that, I am going to be deviating a little bit from these tutorials and doing something a little different. This is something I did a lot as a beginner with watercolors and something I still love to do. Today we are going to paint a galaxy scene. Before we begin, notice how this water has gotten a little bit gross. That's because we keep using this to clean off our brushes and the paint has just muddied the water a little bit. So I want you to grab a new cup of water. It's also been a day since I last recorded this, so all of my paint has dried in my palette. That's okay, this paint is easily reactivated with water, so we can continue to use these paints. What I am going to do, however, is take a damp paper towel, and I'm going to clean out this middle part here where I mixed all my colors. This is because I'm going to be mixing new colors here, so I don't want any of the paints to get muddied with the colors that were already here. Alright, now that we have brand new clean supplies, we can get started on our painting. For the majority of this painting, we are going to be using this bigger paintbrush. Remember, like I said, this is going to hold a lot more water and we'll be able to cover a larger amount of space with it. I'm also going to be using a mixture of these reds and these blues. This painting is going to get messy, so don't worry if your painting looks a bit like a mess. This is going to be a galaxy. We're going to be using a lot of organic shapes and blooms. Nothing is going to be rigid or structured. So the first thing you're going to want to do is wet your paintbrush with the water. And starting at one corner, we're just going to start laying down water. We want a lot of water, so do not be too stingy with this. Once we've covered a wide enough space, we are going to activate this cerulean blue color with our water. As you can see, we've got that paint on our brush now, and we're just going to start dipping it in the water. Feel free to grab more paint if you want. We're just going to start spreading it all over the place. When we get to the edges, we can grab more water on our paintbrush and continue to spread that paint outward. Now what we're going to do is do the same thing with this red color, this scarlet, and we're going to drop some of that in as well. Wipe off your paintbrush, and then mix the colors together on your paper. You will see that the colors will begin to start mixing and create a really pretty purple color. That's exactly what we want. Now continue doing this throughout the rest of the paper. The goal for what you want to do here is just really get a feel for the paint and how they interact with the water. Notice how the paint behaves, how it feels when you spread it around with your paintbrush. Just really get to know the paint. Feel free to go back and forth with the red and the blue as much as you'd like. Once you get to a point that looks a bit like this, what we're actually going to do is take a step away. We are going to let this dry completely before we start again. What we want to do is create different layers of paint to create a more dynamic looking piece. But if we add more paint now, it's all going to melt together in this one layer. So between layers, we want to make sure that the paint dries completely. I used quite a bit of water for this first layer, so it may take a little while for the paint to dry. I'm gonna step away for about 10 or 15 minutes or so and then come back. All right, it's been about 15 minutes and this paper is now dry. I decided I want more purple in this painting, so what I'm going to do is wet my paintbrush, dip it in my cerulean blue, spread some of that blue onto my palette, wipe off my brush, dip it into my scarlet, and place it right next to my blue. Clean off my paintbrush once again, and mix these colors together. That's still a little bit too red for my liking, so I'm going to add a bit more blue. And with this color, I'm just going to start applying it to my paper. Now you'll notice this time I'm applying it to the dry paper. That's because I'm going to apply it to my paper, then dip my paintbrush in the water so it's nice and clean, and then on the edges of this paint, I'm going to apply that water. Basically what I'm doing now is I'm feathering out that paint. I don't want it to have these super harsh edges, so I'm applying a lot of paint now to kind of make those edges spread outward. Remember, the paint is going to go where the water is. So if I keep pulling the paint outward, that paint is going to fill in those spots where the water is. I can even go in and kind of push the paint outward even more. Now I have this cool splotch of purple. I'm going to do that in a few more places where I want the purple to really shine through. Specifically, wherever I have this red, I'm going to basically go over with purple. I can even go back in with that wet on wet technique again to add even more purple. Now the cool thing about watercolor, and the reason why I like to paint in layers, is because you can still see the red and blue peeking out from underneath this purple color. This creates more dimension in your paintings. If you've run out of paint, don't worry, you can just mix more. Again, try to keep in mind though, you don't want to contaminate your paint palettes with colors that aren't what's already in your palette. You'll also notice that these layers are pretty light colored to begin with. That's definitely on purpose. With watercolors, you want to work from your lightest colors to your darkest colors. That's because these are transparent. So you can lay a darker color on top of a lighter color, but you can't really lay a lighter color on top of a darker color. To add contrast to our piece, we're going to do so little by little by adding more layers. This does mean that the process is a little time consuming, but don't worry, it'll be worth it. If you want, you can also go in and add some more blue spots. And we are going to not feather this out. What I want is some contrast. So I'm just going to lay down these colors wherever I want and just keep them like so. And I'm just going to do this in random little splotches. Because the paper is already wet, the color is going to spread out, and that is exactly what I want. If you don't like how one looks in particular, for example, not a fan of this one for whatever reason, you can just take your water and just spread the paint outward. You can see when I lay the two colors next to each other, as long as the paper is wet, they will blend on their own. That is perfect. This is how we get really unique textures, and this is something that's also unique to watercolor as a medium. The colors will mix together and they will lay down dry. So what we're going to do is, again, wait for this layer to dry before we start our next one. Alright, now that this layer has dried, it's time to add more paint. Now, I think my painting is lacking some darker blue, so I'm going to take my ultramarine color now and start adding that into the mix. Now for this color, I want to add a new technique. So I'm going to lay down my wet paint onto a dry piece of paper. I'm going to take a wet, clean paintbrush and feather out only one side. Basically, I want to create both a harsh side of the paint and a feathered side of the paint. This is 100% just personal taste. I think this looks cool, so I like to add it in my paintings. I will just lay down the paint in some kind of squiggly way. There's no right or wrong way to do that. And then I will take it and feather it out. Sometimes I may add more paint just to make it a bit more dramatic. What you can also do is take another color, in this case I'm taking some cerulean, and also add that. And feather that out too. There are some areas where I will just take a splotch of paint and feather out the whole thing. Basically, I'm just using all the techniques I've used so far and just adding them to each new layer. I'm not doing this with any sort of plan in mind either. I'm just kind of going with what feels right. It's also important to remember to keep some of these areas light. We want to leave some areas without paint on them so we have that contrast. A painting needs balance. It needs both light and dark parts. We're basically just adding blobs of paint, one on top of each other, until it begins to look more like a galaxy. There are some areas that I want to leave untouched. For example, right here, I've got this beautiful kind of spreading out pattern, and I don't want anything to interfere with that because I think that looks awesome how it is, so I'm going to make sure that I don't add any layers on top of that. However, where there's areas where it's at least a little bit less exciting, a little boring, I can go in and add some of those textures, like what I did right here. I can also use this technique in other parts of my painting. You'll notice with each new layer you add to the painting, the whole thing comes together just a little bit more. Now that leaves the question, when is it time to stop adding layers? This is something that I actually still struggle with as a professional artist. I often will spend so long on a painting and I'm not sure when's the correct place to stop. Eventually you might just get to a point where it's like, you know what? I'm done working on this piece. I feel like I've worked on this piece enough and it's time to move on to something else. Other times you'll have to actually take a step back and say, okay, I think I've taken this piece as far as it can go and I need to stop myself from adding anything else. I think I've reached that point with this painting. I'm happy with how it looks. I think it looks like a cool galaxy. I've got a lot of different layers going on, but there is one more thing I want to add. So I'm going to add a few last details to this piece to really tie the whole thing together. This is something that I do to almost every single piece because I think it's so fun. So I have not let this layer completely dry. There are some dry spots and there are some wet spots. What I'm going to do is take my paintbrush, I'm going to wet it and dry it off just a little bit. Then I'm going to dip my paintbrush into wet paint. I'm going to use this dark blue to begin with. I've got that paint on my paintbrush, and now I'm going to flick my paintbrush. As you can see, I've got some spots, just little paint droplets going all over the paper. I'm going to do the same thing now with another color, and just add a few more paint droplets. This is a technique that I love to use for stuff like galaxies or mystical forests. It just adds some little interest, just a little bit of bam. I like to do it while my page is partly wet and partly dry too, because where the paper is dry, we've got these perfect, pristine little dots, but where the paper is wet, those dots kind of spread out and create a really cool texture. Once you've done that, you're going to leave this to dry for one last time, and then our piece is going to be complete. Alright, that is going to be it for today's video. I hope you guys had fun learning new watercolors with me. I hope you guys learned some stuff, and I really hope that you take advantage of these lessons in this book and learn watercolors for yourself. And as always, please share your work with us on social media by using our hashtags. We've got hashtag Paletteful Prompt and hashtag Paletteful Packs. If you have not yet joined the Paletteful Packs family, we would love to have you, so please check out our link in the description below to get some for yourself. Anyway, that's going to be it for me today, guys. Thank you so much once again, and I will see you all next month for another Paletteful Packs video.